we invite you for the breakout session. Make deals, break deals, or fake deals. A view from the United Nations Security Council. Will the crises of global institutions lead to more armed conflicts? Do we need more peace operations? How can conflict prevention thrive in today's global environment?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back after the short break for a breakout session here from the Global Outlook track entitled The Russian-Ukrainian War. Is Ukraine falling off everybody's radar? The question of Ukraine has been raised during the conference multiple times. We have had high-level speakers here, including Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Minister Klimkin, and just a moment ago, Hanna Hopko, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But now we move deeply, more specifically into what's happening in Ukraine. And we know that Ukraine is not only facing a war, an existential threat coming from Russia, but also a deep need of political reforms. I think these will all be questions raised during the panel. But before we move to the panel, I am very honored to welcome with us Mr. Bartosz Cichocki, who is the Undersecretary of State in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for Polish Eastern policy. Mr. Cichocki will give a short keynote speech that I hope will be great food for thought to our discussion today. Minister Cichocki, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's going to be rather opening remark than a keynote speech. Opening remarks. I have two news for you. One is a bad one. The other is, I hope, good one. The bad news is that yes, Ukraine, the war in Donbass is falling off the radar. We see more willingness to speculate about the sustainability of sanctions policy. We see increasing interest to engage with Russia in strategic projects, be it in energy, security, in energy cooperation area or otherwise. We see even willingness to involve Russia in area of European defense debate. This has relevance. All those tracks, discussions, speculations have impact on level of visibility, willingness to address the core issue of European security and defense, which is Russia's aggression on Ukraine, Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, of Abkhazia, Tsin Valley region in Georgia, Russia's destabilization, Russian malign actions in the Baltic Sea region, Syria, Libya, etc. Now the good news is that Poland belongs to the strong group of nations that struggle to keep this core issue of Ukraine's territorial integrity, Ukraine's sovereignty, Georgia's territorial integrity, Georgia's sovereignty high on the agenda, and we are successful. Starting with UN Security Council level, we managed to chair a briefing on Ukraine in May under Foreign Minister Chaputovic's chairmanship. So we are active and effective in New York within the UN Security Council. We are active and creative in OSCE, offering initiatives aimed at increasing level of transparency, predictability. Unfortunately, at this stage, Russia seems not to be interested in joining in supporting and encouraging initiatives. Talking about OSCE, I cannot miss the opportunity to underline the importance of SMM mission in Ukraine. Poland is second EU contributor to the mission. We have 40+ monitors working in Luhansk, Donetsk, also in the areas in the land teams in the area controlled by the government. We are supporting and encouraging others to support what we have. We also support discussions on what we can have at some point, like UN peacekeeping mission, other UN formats. We are working very hard to keep not only Donbas on radars, but Crimea as well. Ministry of Foreign, just to give you an example, Ministry of Foreign Affairs sponsored a series of international conferences on legal aspects of Russian occupation of Crimea. Monday in Odessa, next Monday in Brussels. This is under, paradoxically maybe, center of the Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding brand, but also Polish Institute of International Affairs is very much involved. So next Monday, Brussels, and then also Lviv. This is to engage lawyers from different capitals for a discussion on different aspects. Also, how the occupant, what's the responsibility of the occupation force toward the inhabitants of the occupied territory. We are very much involved in support for families of those Ukraine citizens illegally imprisoned in Russia or in Russia's controlled territories. We brought families of those Ukrainian prisoners or hostages to Brussels a couple of months ago, and we are committed to continue. Monday, Minister Czaputowicz announced that the annual award of MFA Pro Dignitate Humana this time will go to Oleg Sentsov, the face of this problem. We are also supporting. We have just, again, these are examples, maybe small individual examples of larger activities. We are helping orphans of the Ukrainian soldiers killed in Donbas to spend holidays in Europe. This month, our Ministry of Finance signed contract for an NGO. It's several hundreds of thousands of Polish zlotys, and this is the generally speaking the good news. And we encourage our allies in the US, Canada, in Europe, in Asia. We also have partners, non-European, non-NATO partners in those activities, in those endeavors to keep Ukraine on the radar. Within NATO, when we push for this process of alliances adaptation to the new reality, Ukraine is an important part of discussion. Eastern flank strengthening is also about war in Donbas, so we are active on NATO forum when we talk about bilaterally with the US on enhanced military presence in Poland, in our region. This is also, it also includes Ukraine, and so we keep we make sure that the Donbas issue, which is part of a bigger picture from Baltic Sea or even north, high north to the southern flank, to be still on the agenda. And we are doing this despite the increasing political domestic costs of some administrative decisions by Ukraine's government against rights of our national minority in Ukraine or within so-called historical dialogue. We are committed as the government to bring more understanding why we have those issues, and we are committed to bilaterally move forward with those issues to solve them, but they will not definitely disappear. So these would be actually my opening remarks. I wish you a good session, productive. This is also part of this struggle to keep Ukraine, to keep the Donbas war on the radar. So thank you for your contribution to this important activity, and we're continuing our efforts. If you have questions, or is it okay or you don't want to have questions?
Does anybody have a question to me?
I think it's better to make it interactive. Maybe I'm sure I missed something. So but if you're not, then it means that I was comprehensive and all the questions were addressed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is my privilege to introduce Jana Kobzowa, who is the policy director at the Rasmussen Center. Is that a center? Who is going to moderate this wonderful panel. Jana, the floor is yours. I also invite all the other panelists to join Jana at the stage.
Thank you, Katarzyna. I think now that half of the audience has moved on the panel, we can start the discussion. As Katarzyna said, I work at Rasmussen Global. And the theme of the panel is very clear. The question is Ukraine being forgotten? And I think, in a way, the video has just provided a very good reason why it shouldn't be forgotten, but we also heard from the minister why that is slowly but surely not being the case. Now, I think if we ask people in this room, the question is, the answer to the question of whether it is falling off the radar is very clear. But I'm afraid that the conference and the real world are connected but not the same. I think what we have seen recently is we do see a lot of headlines about Russia's penchant in elections, in new interest in tourist sites, be it Salisbury or the World Anti-Doping Agency, or its adventures in Syria. But it is true, we have not seen that much when it comes to Ukraine, irrespective of what is happening in Donbas or in the Sea of Azov. And I think besides the reason that ministers mentioned about the newly found and keenness for cooperation with Russia when it comes to economy or Syria, I think one thing that is not a secret is that the efforts and diplomatic talks that are aimed to end the conflict are reaching an impasse. We are now on the 91st or 97th round of talks in Minsk, and we do not see a progress at all. That despite the fact that Russia has increased its escalation, as we are seeing in the Sea of Azov. Now the question is how we can move out of this impasse, how we can restart the dynamic or start changing the calculus in Moscow. I'm really glad I don't need to answer those questions because we have an excellent panel who will help me answering those questions instead of me. And I just want to go straight and start with Eugene. You have been at the forefront of the efforts to mobilize Western support for Ukraine. You're traveling the world, mobilizing support for Ukraine and for a stronger and bolder response to Russia. And I just wondered if you could give us an overview of what you think the West could be doing and is not doing when it comes to helping Russia change its position on Ukraine and helping Ukraine itself. And also maybe if you could talk about mistakes we could have done or we did and how we can change those when it comes to Ukraine. Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you, Jana. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this Warsaw Security Forum. I think that it's a wonderful opportunity in order to address these issues and to ensure that ultimately we mobilize and that we ensure that Ukraine not only does not fall off the radars, but that Ukraine succeeds in defending its territorial integrity and thereby ensures peace, security, and stability in Europe. In terms of probably the biggest mistake that we have committed in addressing the issue of Russia's blatant violations of international agreements and of Ukraine's territorial integrity is that we have allowed President Putin to run with an agenda, and the West is reacting, constantly reacting, sometimes in a robust way, sometimes in a very weak way. But we have not taken the agenda into our hands, and until we do, Ukraine, unfortunately, will be resisting Russian aggression, blatant military aggression, for a longer period of time. Ultimately, Ukraine will succeed. Our forum should be a forum where we look at ways in order to ensure that Ukraine succeeds in the very near future. Since this war is going into its 5th year, since the beginning of the war, 11,000 Ukrainians have perished, over 25,000 have been injured. Ukraine has over 1,500,000 internally displaced persons. Ukraine has become, unfortunately, a territory that subjects 1.9 million people to land that is contaminated with mines. And since the beginning of the aggression, over 2,500 people have perished as a result of stepping on a mine, including 240 children. I think the statistics you have already seen in the video regarding the situation in Crimea, the fact that there are at least 68 political prisoners in Crimea and the Russian Federation, and over 110 hostages in the Donbass, are all compelling reasons for us to be addressing this issue in a much more strategic way and in a way that is not defeatist. I think that if we stop looking at Crimea as a quote-unquote lost territory, and if we start looking in regarding the Donbass in a way to win this war, I think we will succeed. I think that we need to look at measures such as pulling the Russian Federation off SWIFT in order to ensure that the Russian Federation understands once and for all that Western democracies will not tolerate when fundamental freedoms are being blatantly abused, when human rights are being abused. If we start addressing these issues with that perspective and not simply acting when we see increased aggression in the Sea of Azov, and the meek response from the West is that certainly justifies that we renew sanctions. In other words, for blatant increased aggression, we will simply renew sanctions. I think that if we take that kind of an attitude, we will certainly encourage President Putin to be even bolder and more aggressive.
Thank you, Eugene. Could I ask you a follow-up question on sanctions? Because in a way, as you said, the Western sanctions, and I'm talking especially about the EU, are basically responding to the situation of 2014. We have not significantly upgraded the sanctions ever since then. That's not the case on the US side, which now has a legislation in place that allows an increase and dialing up of those sanctions. When it comes to Ukraine, the unity of the West has been critical. Do you now see, with the contemplation of the new sanctions on the US side, including on Nord Stream 2, a rising possibility of disunity, or do you think that dialing up of the US sanctions would have what kind of an effect on the European side, and would it ultimately help Ukraine, or would it create more problems for it, as some argue?
I think at the end of the day, it becomes a question whether there's political will to win and to overcome Russian aggression. And I think the US sanctions should inspire Europeans in the same direction. If we have that type of a reaction, I think that we can succeed in overcoming Russian aggression. If we take the opposite view and send to the Russian Federation mixed signals, when I say mixed signals, I'm talking about a renewal of sanctions while at the same time continuing with Nord Stream 2, That is a mixed signal that emboldens the Russian president to go further. And I think that we have seen every time that the Russian president has seen any weakness in the Western response, any disunity, he has clearly become more aggressive.
Great, thank you, Eugene. Let me move to Yulia. You're following the developments in the Black Sea, and you've been following those developments for a long time. You're a security expert. Could you maybe give us an overview of what is Russia's military strategy in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, especially given the current tensions and developments there now? The concerns about Sea of Azov are not new. There's been a talk about land bridge ever since the Crimea invasion happened. What has been happening recently is dialing up of the escalation, exclusion of Ukrainian ships from their territory, building of the bridge. How is that affecting the broader Black Sea situation, and is there a scope for an EU and NATO reaction, given that these are exclusive waters of Russia and Ukraine?
Even the issue of exclusive or non-exclusive waters is being debated within the UN based on the Friendship Agreement and so on, 2003. But when we look at what Russia has been doing for the last year in Azov, which has major consequences for the larger Black Sea security, is that it has basically taken control of Azov waters entirely through buzzing military capabilities. Assessments are between 20 and 70 military vessels, all armed, partly from the Caspian flotilla moved to the Azov Sea, with the intention of economically strangling the southeast of Ukraine and potentially to destabilize socially the southeastern industrial Ukraine. Beyond buzzing military capabilities in the Azov Sea, we also have seen, since the finalizing of the Kerch Bridge, oceanographic fleet activities in order to create hybrid capabilities in the region, as well as electronic warfare from the Russian side. The scenarios at this point, in order, if we look at what Russia could be doing, what it would like to do, is potentially maybe the lowest scenario, lowest risk, is to pressure Ukraine to resume water supply to Crimea, which suffers because of that. But also it could lead to the loss in viability of southeastern industry in Ukraine. And at this moment, if we look at the military capabilities of Russia and what it could do, is it is able to conduct immediate offensive actions in order to actually outflank through an operation the entire Ukrainian territory. Obviously, this also has consequences economically and security-wise for the Black Sea region, for NATO members as well as non-NATO member states who have vessels there that have been delayed and so on. Now, just to explain how military experts see this, when we think about 10 years ago, the Georgian conflict, everyone was taken by surprise. Everyone, I was. 2014, 6 years later, we were all taken by surprise. But when we look at military exercises of Russia, we shouldn't have been taken by surprise. The 2008 Russian intervention in Georgia was an extension of a military exercise taking place at the border of Georgia by Russia. The 2014 Crimean intervention was simulated almost identically in an exercise, the Zapad exercise of 2013. The 2015 center exercise of Russia simulated the intervention a few months later in the Middle East in Syria. There's also several, this is not, I don't mean to say that all exercises are to be implemented into operations, however, we should pay attention to them. 2016 Caucasus military exercise simulated an attack on the Black Sea, particularly on the ballistic missile defense in Romania, along with many threats to annihilate Romania because of the BMD hosting. And now, 2018, we see a military exercise that has been declared with 7,000 troops in the Caucasus. However, official declarations of Russia were at the same time that it has been the largest military exercise in the Caucasus over the last 30 years, which actually means more than 120,000 troops. And the scenario was joint action to take control of the entire Black Sea region, ending up in nuclear warfare. With an attack by Russia. We've all seen Putin's declaration that Russia would not recently attack, do a first strike, a nuclear first strike, and if there were there were a nuclear war, they will all end up in heaven as martyrs. However, we do not know if this is fake news or not. No one is seriously taking into consideration such a scenario right now, but we should look at the risks, at the operations, at the planning, and think about whether NATO's in-depth deterrence or in-depth defense is an appropriate deterrence method for defending the eastern flank. This is something that we should ask ourselves within NATO and beyond NATO, because if we look at the Black Sea's presence of NATO, this tailored forward presence is a huge imbalance compared to the enhanced forward presence in the north, and we should consider whether Russia has been actually managing to focus NATO attention on the Baltic Sea, which is a military and security threat itself, but at the same time managing to entrench the Black Sea, to use it for power projection into the Middle East, and to secure their domination of the Black Sea.
Julia, thank you. But what concretely can we do? I mean, it's clearly what is happening in Azov Sea is a violation of international law, irrespective of the motives and everything. That's the fact. What concretely we can do? We have seen a number of proposals, starting with an EU CSDP mission, UN maritime mission. In practice, we cannot even agree on increasing the OSCE office presence in Mariupol. Is there anything EU, Western partners can do to help Ukraine to address that problem?
I think there's many things we can do, but we have to start with what we have right now. There's no EU presence. There's no EU action on the Black Sea. However, if we look at the European Parliament that is supporting it, it made several proposals that, in my opinion, are quite viable, such as a EU special envoy to the Black Sea region and to Ukraine, and also a more active overall. Strengthening of the sanctions. We have an enlarged list of 5 extra persons added after the Kerch bridge, but to do more, and in itself to sanction human rights violations. This is something, the only thing that the EU has proposed so far, but it's a starting point. Beyond that, the expansion of the OSCE monitoring mission would be obviously a good idea, but we don't know if it's possible. In my assessment, a UN naval mission is out of the question. I mean, you have Russia in the Security Council, so how do you want to do that? Clearly we have to, as I mentioned before, we have to figure out whether a tailored forward presence in the Black Sea is the appropriate answer. The background to that is, yes, we have a problem of a consensus on threat assessment among NATO member states in the Black Sea. This is something that we have to work on. But we also have a lack of political will in terms of the Western allies into what NATO should do militarily as well as hybrid in the Black Sea. So there's lots to do. The US, as a particular actor, has been contributing significantly, particularly to Ukraine. Ukraine also has several possibilities of increasing capabilities, of figuring out internal waterways in order to access the Azov Sea from outside. But it clearly needs Western support, and we have to figure out what we could do given the lack of political will.
Great, thank you. I think you gave me a nice segue to go into Ukrainian politics and turn to Mustafa as the representative of Ukraine on this panel. Mustafa, I want to talk to you about Donbass and the Minsk agreements, which Ukraine is sticking to. Ukraine, as its Western partner, see Minsk agreements as the only solution to the current war. But I think we would both agree that they're not seem to be going to produce any outcome anytime soon. And they're not particularly popular in Ukraine. No, I'm not talking about the government, but there is a general feeling among many people that these agreements are fundamentally unfair and forced at the barrel of a gun at a situation where Ukraine was at its weakness. Ukraine is holding two crucial elections next year. First, the presidential elections at the end of March, and then the parliamentary elections. Do you think the position of Kiev vis-à-vis Donbass, Russia, and Minsk agreements can fundamentally change after these elections?
Thank you very much. I would start from the moment when we signed Minsk agreement to remind people how it happened. We signed Minsk agreement when corpses on our streets coming from the front line, and when we had hundreds of died people every day. It was September 2014 and February 2015. And under this pressure, our president signed this agreement, protocols. And you know that the other side who signed it was not Russia, it was terrorist groups. And that is very important for all of us to understand what we are taking as a source of international law. The papers which was signed by terrorists. That is very important. And I think that last 4 years, our government and president and parliament, we tried to prove ourselves and to the world that, look, okay, we did it. We signed them because we didn't have any other options. But do they work? The first paragraph of this agreement says ceasefire. It doesn't have it for all 4 years. The second, it's about withdrawing of all weapons and troops from our territory. It doesn't happen. So now we should be very aware that Ukrainian people, soldiers and politicians, which are living under these conditions and with this agreement, understands that it doesn't work. So what we can expect from our country after election. Of course, this agreement was signed by President Poroshenko. And you know that his opponents, not even opponents, many of his allies, thinks that it was wrong decision. But they supported him because he was our president, he is our president, and we will support what he did. But from the other side, it is obvious that I can say as a politician, as a member of parliament, I want to change it. I don't want to lie to my people. I don't want to lie to people in Ukraine on the local level and villages that, you know, we should be under this decision of our president and we should follow Minsk agreement, which doesn't work. Just because, you know, it's very sweet lie, which helps us to have sanctions on Russia. But sanctions on Russia is not about Minsk agreement. It's about occupation of Donbass and Crimea. So these papers, they are not changing the real situation. So I think that after presidential election and parliament election, we should change the modality of Minsk agreement and the approach of this conflict. And coming back to the conditions of this agreement consists of very specific propositions. And first is withdrawing of all foreign troops from Ukrainian territory. The second, it's holding election in that territory, allowing people to elect their local government and to participate in national elections, but after withdrawing of foreign troops. These two conditions can be done by other tool, which is peacekeeping mission. And peacekeeping mission is one of the tools which can fulfill all these requirements of Minsk agreement. So I think that after presidential and parliament election, we'll have big shift toward real tools of solution for this conflict.
But could you elaborate a bit more? How would you change it? If the proposition is there should be a peacekeeping force, I mean, that has been aired for a number of years now, and as we have seen, even with the latest proposals, it is being blocked at the Security Council. How would you get that dynamic changed?
Okay, you know, the peacekeeping mission is not the question only from Ukraine, it's about our partners also, yeah? So what we can say that the conditions, again, conditions of Ukraine, what requirements, what we need extend this mission to whole territory of Donbass and control above the border. But the dynamic of this changing, I don't know. We should see who will be next president. Of course, we have big hopes that it can be some democratic third power. Yes, and you know that Ukraine have a chance to elect this man, but we can have the same president. But definitely we'll change parliament. Yes, because we see that by rates, but we will change parliament. And the conflict between parliament and president will be much more obvious than now. So I think that the next year, till the end of the next year, we will not change this situation, but again and again, Minsk agreement will be one of the points which will be used by opposition, but all opposition, democratic opposition and party of region and those who from previous regime to attack president and his campaign. And after election, all of them will fulfill their promises that they will change Minsk agreement modality.
That would be one of the rare cases when Ukrainian politicians deliver on their promises, maybe. But I think, I mean, I have questions about how would you change it, but I think the audience would like to ask some of these questions as well. So we move to another speaker and then leave space for questions from the audience. Let's move to Agnia. Could you talk a bit more about Russia? I mean, you're an energy expert, and we have heard before about the importance of EU and US and EU unity when it comes to sanctions and obviously and pressure on Russia, and obviously gas and energy does play a role. Could you enlighten us and talk us through where you see that leverage being played out by Russia or not? Because, you know, some of the member states did take precautions and did take a number of measures to decrease that pressure or dependence on Russia. Do you see the dynamics changing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly see Russia trying to influence the EU and European Union states via its energy resources, sweet deals, investment deals, and so on. And this is not a new phenomena. I mean, in fact, the Kremlin has been trying, I would say, to co-opt or at least partner with major European energy companies since the late 60s, early 70s. And that's how we've seen partnerships that have been established between companies like Germany's E.ON, Italy's Eni, France's Engie, Austria's OMV, that go back to the very first Soviet gas exports. And but what's the change has been today with Nord Stream 2, we see that, you know, they have built on kind of past success and relationships, and during this very critical time, they're trying to also use the Nord Stream 2 project as a way to create disunity. And I have to comment, I just came back, literally this week, I was in northern Germany in Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and this is the region where Nord Stream 1 lands and Nord Stream 2 is planned to land. And last week, the governor of this region of the Mecklenburg-West Pomerania state, Manuela Schwesig, actually wrote an op-ed that we should cooperate with Russia. And, you know, there was just a perfect example, all these arguments that you know, Russia is a large investor in our region, we get jobs, there's a lot of companies in our region that are under Russian ownership, and therefore even stating in this op-ed that, well, sanctions should, you know, we should work towards dismantling sanctions, and by working with Russia, you know, on deals like this and energy partnerships like this, we can hope to bring peace to Ukraine. Well, that was quite a twist of words. Of course, days later, they celebrated Russia Day in Rostock. So you can imagine that. I wanted to, if I see her, I'll remind her that, you know, Russia used to sponsor Russia Days in Crimea before they annexed it. So.
Thank you. Could I ask, I mean, because there was another session on Nord Stream 2, so I don't want to go into all of that, but one question building on the sanctions discussion is the sanctions an answer that can stop Nord Stream 2? Because the view in Europe is obviously that it's not about the sanctions, a lot of that is about applying existing legislation when it comes to energy markets, which is not for the moment being applied to Nord Stream 2. But if the US takes the decision to sanction Nord Stream, would you see that as basically the killer of the project, or do you think that the project would and can go ahead anyway?
You know, it's a tough one, but I'm optimistic that U.S. sanctions would have, even the threat of these sanctions can have an impact. And here I would point at some of the, particularly the European companies involved in this project. So, for example, Germany's Uniper, their leadership has said that they would consider pulling out if there was the real risk of U.S. sanctions, because they wouldn't want to face those risks. I think Shell is another company that I don't know if they would. They're not in the pipeline building business. I'm surprised they're in this project to begin with. Companies probably like Wintershall and OMV would, hold on to the last, the end, and probably not for no reason. Putin danced in that wedding just recently. So I think they'll have support there in Austria. But there are a number of bills in the Hill between the Senate and Congress that would implicate Nord Stream 2. Also, there is CATSA that basically gives the U.S. room to impose sanction on Russian pipeline projects, not just Nord Stream 2, but also Turk Stream. And that also signals that there is real risk for Western companies involved in Russian pipeline projects.
Could we move to Adam? We were sitting in Poland, and obviously Central and Eastern Europe has been at the forefront of calling for a bolder response to what Moscow was doing in Ukraine for a long time, not least from 2014. And it's the case now as well. But the relationship, and we have heard it also from Minister Chichotsky when he was speaking, is not completely ideal, especially when it comes to some of the countries such as Poland and Hungary and the bilateral relationship between these countries and Ukraine. Could you comment a bit more on how Central Europe is dealing on its relationship with Ukraine, and how you see that relationship developing in the light of, on one hand, probably a shared interest in addressing Moscow's aggression, but then having all these bilateral challenges that are coming into foreplay in politics as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Jana, for your question. Well, first of all, I would like to stress that there are different countries in Central Europe. When we are talking about Visegrad 4, there is Poland, and for sure, Ukraine has always been a top partner for Poland, apart from transatlantic community. And it has not changed for good reasons. It is not just a threat from Russia. It is also a cultural proximity, history. All this does matter. In case of Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, we should not miss the big change which has been achieved over the last 5 years. So Ukraine has never been on a radar screen of those countries, and the Russian invasion on Ukraine has changed it. It changed it mainly when we are talking of a V4 Visegrad Group format. All these countries eagerly supported European integration of Ukraine. They have accepted and ratified an association agreement. They were appealing for having a visa-free regime for Ukrainians. And within V4 format, we had a number of meetings of V4 Plus. Ukraine was invited to join a V4 European Union battle group. There were some programs when it comes to energy support of Ukraine. All these reverse flows for Ukraine had a great role in securing Ukraine's energy independence. And my first point would be that even though there are some tensions in bilateral relations, we should not miss the grand picture. And the grand picture is that in the last 5 years, not only Poland, but also other Central European countries have been strongly supporting Ukraine, even if some politicians were, less vocal about it or somehow critical, like the Prime Minister of Hungary, like Prime Minister of Slovakia, like President of Czech Republic. But still, all these countries supported a tough line against Russia. All of those countries supported sanctions which have been imposed on Russia. It is point one. Point two, well, maybe just to provoke discussion with our Ukrainian friends, I would argue that the problem, to some extent, is a bit different. So, Central Europe and Central European countries are off the radar screen of Ukraine. It is a problem. It is a problem that today Ukrainian government has wide open doors to Brussels, to Berlin, and there is, well, a temptation to neglect Poland, Warsaw, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia. And it is a problem we should also discuss. Well, there are lots of experts in Poland who cover Ukraine on a daily basis. Lots of pundits or experts who keep an eye on what's going on in Poland. There are no experts on Poland. There are not to mention Slovakia, Hungary, or Czech Republic in Ukraine. And level of interest of Central Europe in Ukraine is very, very limited. So it is point number two, that it takes two to tango. It takes two to tango, and the problem we have been facing is a limited interest of Ukraine about Central Europe. And point number three, because you asked me about bilateral relations, so between all these tensions between Poland and Ukraine regarding memory policy, historical issues, Hungarian-Ukrainian tensions about minority issues. But, you come from Slovakia, you well know that, there is some, well, distrust about Ukraine starting from 2009 Russian-Ukrainian gas crisis. And the level of distrust among the society is relatively strong. Sure, I don't want to elaborate on bilateral issues. It is not the topic of the discussion today, so I don't want to say who is, whose fault it is that we cannot go along together and our relations are somehow in tensions. But I would argue that certainly Ukrainian government has a full right to define its memory policy and even to ignore sensitiveness of Central European countries, or Poland in this case. But well, the problem is that it brings price to pay. So it negatively influences social moods in Poland and in Hungary, and it domestically increases a political price, a political cost for any Polish, for any Hungarian government to engage in a pro-Ukrainian policy. It should be stressed, however, that in case of Poland, it does not influence on a general picture. And it was mentioned by Mr. Tichowski during his keynote address. But the problem is that with some negative feelings and in the ground among societies, it may become more and more difficult to continue with a strong pro-Ukrainian policy vis-à-vis Russian aggression. Thank you.
Great. Adam, we want to go into the questions. I just have a very short follow-up question on what you just said, and I agree there is a level of distrust across the region, which is not unique just for Ukraine or Slovakia or Hungary. It is something that we all in the region need to address. But I think there is a certain difference between historical and current political disputes among different countries, which are not new, as you said, and at what point they start reaching the multilateral level. And we have seen that with Hungary and Ukraine ahead of the NATO summit. We might see the repetition of that ahead of the Association Council between Ukraine and the EU in December. Do you see, I'm not saying an easy way out because there is not an easy way out, but do you see anything the Central Europeans or the Ukrainians can and should try to do to avoid having those bilateral talks and discussions spiraling out of control and affecting the overall relationship between Ukraine and its Western partners?
Well, indeed, it is a problem. And, you know, I mentioned the V4+ format, which proved to be extremely efficient, which proved to be an engine of a pro-Ukrainian statement from all 4 governments of Central Europe. But today, it is not working so well, and there are 2 additional problems. So one problem is certainly some tensions, bilateral tensions, which negatively influence. But the second problem is that there is a shift within V4, a shift in the focus. So we have been focusing more and more about internal European Union developments, with the migration crisis recently being the hot potato, the most important topic to be discussed. And as a result, it leads to a situation when Ukraine gets out of the radar screen. And it is a fact we should somehow acknowledge. But also, and it is just maybe a positive part of it, well, Ukraine gets out of the radar screen because situation in Ukraine is relatively stable. Russian aggression and Russian attempts to transform Ukraine to be a failed state were unsuccessful. The situation in Donbass is stable. Russia did not manage to influence the situation in Ukraine proper with the destabilization of Donbass. The economic situation of Ukraine is relatively stable. So, you know, no need to be focused on Ukraine in a way we have been all focusing on Ukraine in 2015.
Right, thank you. The title of the session is Ukraine falling off everybody's radars, and you just said it might not be necessarily a bad thing only. I want to give floor to the audience because I see a lot of faces who follow Ukraine, are experts who followed it professionally for a long time. So please, if you have any comments or questions to the panelists, raise your hand. And introduce yourselves. I think we will only have one round of questions, so please be succinct and clear so we can go back to the panel and then we close the session. Please, gentlemen over there. No, I think we need microphone. It's coming to your place, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Meyer, I come from Washington. I recently read U.S. government analysis that the level of corruption in Ukraine in the siphoning of hundreds of millions of dollars into personal bank accounts materially affected the ability of the Ukrainian military in equipment and training to counter the Russian moves in the East. I'd like to know what you think of that, if that's viable, and if it is, what guarantees do Washington and the EU have that the same thing wouldn't happen again?
Great, thank you. Gentleman over there.
My name is Mikołaj Stawicki. I'm from the Warsaw School of Economics. And I would like to ask, because we all know that Europe right now has a lot of internal problems, and such as Brexit and different views on the policies that should be pursued by the EU internally. I would like to ask if you think that there can be still some genuine interest in Ukraine in general and war in Donbass in Western Europe. And in what way would you encourage the Western European partners to draw some attention to the situation in Ukraine? Because in my opinion, it can turn out that the V4 does not have enough soft power to draw the attention of Western Europe to Ukraine, especially given the current political situation. So my question is, how would you address this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. We move to Minister Onyszkiewicz.
One question regards the legal status of Azov Sea, because it could be either considered a sea under the rule of universally accepted convention, but there was also an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, sort of limiting or pushing aside this sort of general arrangement, which gave Russia the pretext to make all sorts of obstacles. What could be done to sort of clarify the legal state of Azov Sea? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question over there.
So my name is Arik Burakovsky. I'm from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And the subject of this panel is whether Ukraine can remain on the radar of Europe. And as has already been said at this conference many times, Europe is currently preoccupied with a number of internal problems, including the migration crisis and the erosion of political values. And yet, Ukraine needs to be looked at on an ongoing basis. It requires our attention. And so my question for the Ukrainians is, what steps can Ukraine take to better communicate about its reforms, not only about the conflict in Donbass, but issues like decentralization and anti-corruption to European policymakers and the public? Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think we will turn to the panel because we have about 7 minutes to answer all these questions. Maybe, Julia, could you take the question about Azov, and then we move to all the other panelists? And could you please combine it with your concluding remarks as well?
I'll do my best. The Azov Sea legal status, as many international legal issues, is a very complicated one. One of the bases is the Friendship Treaty of 1997 that was abrogated by Ukraine, when was it? In September this year. But the core element is the treaty, the agreement for Azov of 2003 that states that based on a bilateral agreement between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, the Azov Sea is our internal historical waters. Now, Ukraine is considering, there's many voices in Ukraine, to unilaterally abrogate this treaty, this agreement, but there will be consequences, negative consequences for Ukraine, potentially. And at the same time, Ukraine has gone to the UN, UNCLOS, in 2016 to file a lawsuit against Russia, which Russia objects to based on logistical approaches and not on content. So the UNCLOS case will be dragged on for years now. And nevertheless, the problem that we have with international law generally is that it's not binding. So even if Ukraine would have legal possibilities to impose upon Russia any agreement, Russia has no incentive to respect this because there's no sanctions on international law. So I think the approach that we should have on this is what can we do in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea that is beyond international law, because international law is non-binding, so it's not helpful for us. And just briefly, also regarding there were several questions on how we can draw back attention to Donbass and to Ukraine, Russia's aggression, especially in Europe. We should not, maybe we should change the framework. You mentioned Europe as a term, and Ukraine is in Europe. It's not a matter, it's not in the EU, but it concerns the EU directly. So my personal hope is that with the change, with the EU elections next year and the change in High Representative, we will have and should have an Eastern dimension, comprehensive Eastern dimension of EU foreign policy. This is a starting point, I think, that is very necessary right now.
I think that hope is shared by many in this room. Adam and Agni, could you maybe comment a bit more on how the West should respond and to the other questions that you had from the audience, maybe on the corruption as well, if you want to?
So just 4 minutes and 12 seconds, so maybe I will just focus.
That means 1 minute for one.
I will just focus on Minsk Accords. You know, we have reasons not to like Minsk Accords, but still we should acknowledge that even though there is a stalemate, It provided Ukraine with some kind of, with a basic stability, and it serves as a baseline of West unity when it comes to anti-Russian sanctions and a position on Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Sure, Minsk Accords is unimplementable, we can't do it, but, and neither Russia nor Ukraine will implement it, and there will be a blame game for many, many months and years to come. But I believe it is relatively convenient for Ukrainian side, because it is Russia who should accept some concessions as a first step. So my recommendation would be, first, do no harm. We should stay firmly with Minsk, and I fear that any change in this regard will be in Russia's favor.
Well, I would call out the people in this room. We're here, policymakers, opinion makers, academics. Let's keep the war that is going on the European continent right now on the front pages, on the agenda, and a major talking point. Russia wants to create a gray zone in Europe. They have succeeded to an extent in Moldova, trying to do that in Georgia and Ukraine. Let's not let them get away with it again. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Mustafa and Eugene, could you maybe talk a bit more about the corruption issue that has been raised, not just for military, but we have seen reports of other cases. And the question that I think is being asked by many people, how can Ukraine better communicate its successes, which it has had despite the challenges it is facing? Maybe let's start with Mustafa and finish with Eugene, because he started the panel in the beginning.
About corruption, I think it takes lion's share of our fight in Ukraine now for politicians, especially for young politicians. And of course we have our homework and we are doing that. But you will be surprised if I say you that the lion's share of money which is stealing from our budget is not spending in Ukraine. It's spending in Europe, in London, in Vienna, for all these years of our independence. And we don't see any sanctions or investigations about politicians who are now in power in Ukraine or who were in power in Ukraine. So that is not only our problem. The second is, you should control them. If you know that they're corrupt, if you know the politicians who are, for example, head of Parliament Committee of National Security and Defense is totally corrupt, people say it directly, openly in our investigations, in media, why you're working with them. That is very clear. We don't want you to work with them. Of course, they have official position. Of course, we are doing our homework. I'm saying as a politician that we are trying to fight them. In parliament election, we will do everything we can do to shift them and to replace them. But it's not only our issue. About our achievements and about why Ukraine is not on the radar all these, or not on radar so obvious than before. You know, that is the nature of politicians, not only in Ukraine, but in all the world. You don't know and don't want to know about positive news. How many people knows about public procurement system in Ukraine, which is one of the best in the world? I don't think many people, but about corruption knows everyone. Who knows about police reform in Ukraine? I think many people doesn't even suspect that we did it. But many people knows who are corrupt in Ukraine. So this is nature of politicians. It's not something new. But what I want to say about war and about occupation, about Russia and about conflict, you know, after 2014, I would say maybe as a young man, as young politicians, actually we don't care who remember about that or not. Of course, we appreciate and grateful for all support and help to Ukraine, for all partners and those who are helping out now in these days and all these 4 years. But at least we are fighting on our front line. It is our soil. We will do it anyway. But the things which happened in Ukraine is totally false of Western countries, which allowed Russia to do that in their own country. The violation of human rights, breaking the human rights, killing people, killing oppositioners, Magnitsky list, all these issues happened before war in Ukraine. But Western countries proceeded saying, as Merkel said, we don't want to tease this beer. That is behavior of Western countries towards Russia all these years. And now we have just next occasion for the West to prove for what they are standing for money or for values. We will defend our soil. We doesn't have other option. But the problems we had 4 years ago now is in the houses of European countries and United States. Remember what we said about propaganda disinformation? People said, oh, you have conflict. It's conflict in Ukraine. It's not a problem. Now, United States, European countries have the same problem. Just 4 years. Remember when we told about hybrid war and about troops which were in Crimea, and world said, no, it's not a problem. Now we understand that they are, and Putin recognized that. So what we can do, we can just hope the European countries will be much smarter than they did all these 4 years and 25 years before. And as a young politician who are in connect with the politicians in your countries, I know that the new generation, they know about that. They know that it's dangerous. But the old politicians, old elite in Europe, in our country, they think that they can still deal with Russia like in old times, which is a lie. It's not true. It doesn't work. So it's up of the states what they're going to do with their young generation of politicians. Thank you.
When Europe is preoccupied with Brexit, with migration crisis, with terrorism, the way we, the Ukrainian World Congress, try to keep Europe focused is to indicate very clearly that Ukraine is the difference between living in a secure and stable world, or President Putin, should Ukraine not withstand Russian aggression, testing Article 5 of NATO, and us experiencing the Third World War. When one looks at it from that perspective, the issue of Ukraine takes a high priority. I think that the Russian president has indicated with cyber attacks, state terrorism in the UK, with financing political parties and interfering in election processes in the various countries, that clearly this is not simply a question of Ukraine. This is challenging Western democracies, and we can either wake up and smell the coffee or suffer the consequences. I think that if we want, and I'll end with that, with a few short suggestions. If we want to win this, we need to strategize. We need to strengthen sanctions. We need to start a dialogue on removing the Russian Federation from SWIFT, on human rights violations for all of those countries that have not yet adopted legislation akin to the Magnitsky legislation. That legislation should be adopted. For those who have adopted that legislation, to use it in order to show that we will not tolerate human rights violations. And I think that finally, it is extremely important for NATO to give Ukraine a map in order to ensure that there is a clear message that Ukraine can choose its course, and that Western democracies will not only respect it, but ensure that that choice is carried out.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think my personal answer to the question whether Ukraine is falling off radar is it might be falling off radar, but it's not going anywhere as a challenge and as an opportunity. And unless we together address that, we're not going anywhere either, except for the coffee break in a second. Please join me in a round of applause for everyone on the panel and for you in the room.